Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of Woke Bros. Of course, I'm your co-host, Big Wos, aka Wosdy Lambre, joined as always by my gracious co-host out on the west side of Los Angeles, Nando Vila. What's up, brother?
How's it going, baby?
I'm good, and today we have a very, very, very special guest, man. I'm excited about this. Y'all know we don't do a lot of guests on here, but when we do, it's best-selling authors and just overall media killers, man. We don't fuck around on this show when we get a guest. Joining us today is senior reporter at the Huffington Post and author of The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. My boy, Zach Carter. Welcome to the show, Zach Carter.
Thanks for having me, guys. I admit that's the best intro I've ever had.
Well, that's what we do. Over here at Woke Bros, we have the best intros, not the best information, just the best intros. We don't give a fuck about being smart or right or interesting or provocative or any of those things that you're good at, Zach. We just like having good intros.
Yeah. Well, then we'll make a great team.
Awesome, man. Yo, today we wanted to have you on the show because we tend to have a very economics-based show, right? Basically, the issues that affect everyday working people in America, not oligarchs, not people who got cushy-ass jobs within the oligarchy, right? Like people who, don't have a crazy amount of savings and, just barely pay their mortgage or rent or whatever, like normal people. And that's part of your, for lack of a better word, beat at the Huffington Post. Could you talk to us about the type of things that you cover at HuffPo?
Sure. I was brought in initially to write a newsletter on money, and I just never did it. And instead,
an excellent fail boy already. I love it.
This is like 10 years ago. This is when Ryan Grimm was the DC bureau chief. He hired me. He's at The Intercept now, and instead just started writing about the Fed and the housing crisis. So this was 2010, 2011, and we were in the middle of the Great Recession, and I wrote a lot about the Obama administration's response to the crash, which most of my coverage was pretty critical of it, but also wrote a lot about Washington's sort of broad indifference to the crash. The things that the Senate and the House were focused on really had nothing to do with this enormous economic catastrophe that had just hit the entire country. It's not like this was localized to one district or something, and it was like a special favor to some lawmaker. This is a whole country that was really falling apart. And I think a lot of the sort of craziness of our politics today is a result not only of the crash, but of the inadequate response to it 10 years ago. I think our politics, people saw the country really working for the wrong people at that moment, and then saw that sustained for several years under an ostensibly very liberal progressive president. So that's what I cover. Obviously I don't cover the Obama administration, the age of Trump, but economic policy and how it affects ordinary people.
Yeah, and when Woz and I were chatting about doing this episode, I immediately suggested you because he wanted to find someone to talk about. There's a new Biden administration. We're in the middle of an economic crash. It's almost like a repeat of 2008 in many ways. History happens first as tragedies, then as farce, and this feels like that for sure. And you just wrote this book, The Price of Peace, on John Maynard Keynes and his economic philosophy. It's been like, I don't know, has there ever been since Piketty's Capital, there hasn't been an economics book or an economics history book that has been this kind of buzzy, I would say. And one of the problems with the response to the 2008 financial crash that the Obama administration did was this obsession with austerity, that we had to be fiscally neutral in any response. There was the grand bargain with Mitch McConnell to basically slash Social Security and all that stuff. And it feels like that kind of politics is changing a little bit. I'm hesitant to say it's been completely changed, but it doesn't feel as hegemonic as it was in 2008. So can you describe a little bit of what we can expect, as the Biden administration takes power they too have to respond to an economic crash.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's been sort of a change in the intellectual wind among the sort of elite policymaking community. The people who Obama was listening to in 2009 and 2010, when he had to make the most important decisions of his presidency, at least in terms of the economy, were people like Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, who came from this very markets know best kind of school of thought. And that's a strange crew to rely on when you've just had a financial crisis. I mean, it's the financial crisis is a clear case of markets not working, right, and wreaking social havoc. But part of that worldview is not only that markets know best, but that if the government intervenes in the economy, like the economy is this thing that exists out here, and the government is something separate, and if the government moves into the economy, that's sort of like an unnatural changing, reordering of the way the world works, and that will create distortions and create problems that are further down the line. Mm-hmm. So I think they believed, you had to do something because the crash was so deep, but they were very, very careful about, and very cautious about not doing too much. Part of this was due to political fears that they just didn't think that Republicans would let them do enough. But there was a general belief that if you rescued the banks would lead the recovery, not the federal government. And
Zach, I have to interject here. I have to ask the question: how can someone hold both beliefs that the government should never step into the free market and the banks should be bailed out? I don't understand that. If the free market is perfect and always works itself out, and the government should never do anything to help anything because the government is bad, 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 and the market is good, 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 how can those people, those Geithner types, how did they intellectually justify holding those two thoughts at the same time?
It's quite a dance, isn't it? I think, on the right, there are people who hold the view that you just sort of characterized there, that we shouldn't bail out the banks, we shouldn't bail out anybody, we shouldn't there should be no social safety net for anyone.
Everyone should die.
Yeah, essentially. and I think the view of the that at least Geithner held around 2009, 2010 was that that is too harsh, that actually leads to huge social problems that you don't come back from. And so instead of letting the whole world burn, that they'll make some adjustments. But it's I actually think this is something I sort of talked about in the book. I mean, if you take John Maynard Keynes' ideas seriously and you read what he wrote over the course of his lifetime, I think is sort of the high point, the most important intellectual contribution he made is probably the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1937. But he's got a lot of other works that sort of you have to read to understand what is going on in that book. And if you take the book seriously, he's really saying that markets don't really work. That on most of the time, if you leave things to the market, the vast majority of the time, you're going to have what he calls an unemployment or underemployment equilibrium, meaning things will come to rest at a state where things are bad. There'll be a whole lot of unemployed people. Markets won't just work things out on their own. So you need to have the government supplying what he calls aggregate demand in order to make the markets work at all. Otherwise, you don't have a market. You have just sort of this machine of misery that kind of grinds on without any hope. For a long time in the economics profession, I think in part because Keynes was so successful at persuading parts of the economics profession about parts of his ideas, people came to believe actually that markets did work most of the time, but it's only in these sort of rare periods of crisis where they get sort of jostled. There's an exogenous shock, is what economists say, meaning something they didn't see coming happens. And after that shock, then you need to make the correction. But most of the time it works out. And the thing that I think people kind of forgot over the course of the 20th century is that the government is much more involved in the economy on a day-to-day basis than it was in the 1930s. I think I don't have the precise numbers in front of me, but at the peak of FDR's peacetime, New Deal work, he was spending something like 10 or 11% of the entire output of the economy was coming from the federal government. Under Reagan, it was 20%. So wow. just casually, we ended up having just a much, much bigger part of the economy being supervised or running through the government in some way. And we forget that all the time. The government's always managing the economy in some sense. The question is who they manage it for. And I think we saw that very clearly in the 2008 crash and the response to it. And I think we're seeing it, frankly, in the response to the COVID crash. There have been some good things that the government has done for working people. I think the expansion of unemployment benefits
was beautiful.
Was really, really important thing. And I think really changes the way that working people relate to their jobs. Because if you have this alternative, like you can now work and be fine, then your boss has got to be better to you, right? And that's it gives you some bargaining power. And so, but that was sort of rolled out almost, I think, by accident. I don't think Republicans really realized what they were agreeing to when that happened. But it was 3 months, and then they rolled it back, and now we've got sort of a mini version of it that's coming back out for a few months in 2021. But it's very clear that the government can just turn on or turn off who it wants to help. And I do think there's been a shift in thinking.
Can you say that again, please, Zach? Could you please say that again? Because it's something that we do try to hammer home here every single freaking episode. But the government can help out whoever they want, whenever they want.
For a long time, people believed, or people claimed, that there was this very hard limit to how much the government could actually spend total. That if it spent too much, you'd have a 2008 style financial crisis or hyperinflation or something. I don't think economists really believe that anymore. They believe, maybe if we spend too much, eventually you could have some sort of like accumulating inflation or something, but not like an immediate off a cliff. Now you're 1923 Weimar Germany kind of problem. So the barrier to helping people is not the amount of money that we have in the economy. It's the political will to actually do something, and that is. I think Biden, I'm really surprised to hear him say this, given the way he talked during the campaign, particularly during the primary. Last week, he said, now's the time to spend trillions of dollars investing in our communities and in our people. And it's like, yeah. I mean, frankly, I think it's always the time, but now.
Well, let's back up for a second. And who was Keynes? Why was he so important? Why did you choose to write a book about this guy who's been dead for 80 years? And why is he relevant today? Like what and why do you think, I guess just a general, who the hell was this guy if someone has never heard of him, and what was his effect?
Yeah, I mean, I got into him during the crash. I was a banking reporter. I started working in 2006, and I was so sad that I had to do it. I'd played in punk rock bands before that, and my band got back from tour, and I had to get a real job because I was broke. And I thought banking. I mean, what is more boring than covering banking in 2006? But it turns out it was actually really a great time to be covering banking because it was about to just explode. And I had a fairly conventional, I think, view of the economy for a financial journalist at the time. I talked to all these sources who said markets usually get it right, and I knew all these people who traded in the markets and gave me their reasons and their sort of elaborate mathematical rationales for, which resources were going to go up or down in value based on what was actually happening in the economy. And I was not like I was not like a radical guy, but the crash happened, and all these people suddenly started saying, well, now we have to bail out the banks and do a fiscal stimulus package. And I had kind of the same reaction you just did, Wos. Like it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, you guys were just saying markets always work, and now you're saying they don't. And they would give a reason. They weren't idiots. And I don't think they were hypocrites. I think they'd actually changed their minds. I mean, they'd changed their minds in a way that happened to be like particularly self-interested, but people
funny how that works.
Yeah. But so I just thought, well, there's no way that these guys are well versed in this new thing that this religion they've suddenly converted to, right? Like there's no way they know much about it. So I started trying to read it, and I tried to read the general theory, and it's just it's like trying to chew a bag of nails. It's just a really unpleasant read for the most part. So I switched to The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which is a book that Keynes wrote in 1919, critiquing the Treaty of Versailles, which is the document that ended of the First World War. And that book is fun to read. It's a piece of political and economic theory. It's an economic analysis of a diplomatic contract, but it is actually a really exciting, fun read. And it's not too long, which was helpful for me at the time. So I was just sort of taken away by the sort of sweep and the grandeur of this text, which actually has nothing to do with deficits at all. It just says, look, if you set up a world in which Germany can't afford has these debt obligations through what they call reparations, sort of Germany's responsible for the wars, they got to pay everybody all this money. If you make Germany pay all this money, they're not going to be able to afford to. The country's going to go broke, and they're going to hate all of us. And you are going to breed resentment because he didn't use the word austerity, but you are going to create de facto austerity in Germany. You're not going to let that country sort of get back on its feet economically. And there are all sorts of people who have critiqued the foreign policy implications of this analysis over time. But ultimately, I think his economic analysis and his political analysis, psychological insight was pretty much right. You do see Germany economically being crushed at the end of the war and immediately afterwards. You do see the rise of this extremely violent far-right xenophobic party in the Nazis pretty quickly. You have political assassinations and murders that are happening fairly routinely. And I do think I think Keynes was basically right that there was a connection between the type of externally imposed social misery that was going on and the volatile, violent politics that were happening in the country. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that was a lot more interesting than debt and deficits. And I just kept reading. And I think for this moment, ultimately, I see Keynes as a moral philosopher who sort of happened to stumble into economics because it was a way to exert influence over the political system. He wasn't actually particularly adept at being a statesman or a diplomat for most of his life. If you look at the policy battles he got involved with from 1918 all the way to 1942, maybe, he loses just about every single battle he's involved in. But along the way, he creates this huge body of literature explaining why he thinks we should do these particular policies. And he's really more a philosopher of crisis. He's somebody who says, look, if you have social upheaval creates this intense sense of uncertainty among people, and it pushes people towards violence and towards authoritarian politics. And he says he spends most of his time focused on the right, but he also does make this critique of communism in Europe as it's rising at the time. He says, if you want to avoid people turning to authoritarian communism in Europe or to fascism in Europe, you need to have a state that's very actively involved in making sure that people feel taken care of materially, that their needs are being met. And if you don't do that, they're going to revolt, essentially. And
we're not talking about that rinky-dink shit in the Capitol last week either. We talking about some real shit.
I think you're seeing what the rise of Trump, a fairly toxic right-wing figure. Mm-hmm. You're seeing the appeal of right-wing politics all over Europe as well, in the wake of a crisis. It's exactly what you're talking about, right? That there was a crisis in 2008, and we've seen the rise in right-wing politics. It seems fairly straightforward in that sense.
I think so. Right. And I think this discussion sort of goes off the rails when people start trying to analyze why any particular person became drawn to any particular right-wing event. The attack on the Capitol on Wednesday, there are a lot of different groups that are involved in that. Not all of them are hardcore neo-Nazis. There's, they come for different reasons. But once they show up there, the thing is, once you get involved in the politics, then people start to sort of take on a new political identity. And at that point, it's not just as simple as giving somebody a check and they're like, oh, cool, I'm not a Nazi anymore, right?
Right.
But you can see the frustration with the government, the belief that the system, in some sense, whether it's the international system, in after World War I, or the just domestic economic, financial and political system in the United States after 2008. Although let's be clear, this is happening all over the world. The U.S. isn't the only country that's got a problem with far-right politics right now. There are people who are frustrated with the political system, and a lot of the things that they say, you couldn't. When they say them, you're like, well, you can imagine somebody on the left making saying a similar comment in a different context 10 years earlier about like the country failing them with the Iraq War or something like that. And so I don't think that these events arise just out of this sort of spontaneous flowering of ill will from people. Right. And I think that's different from saying people aren't responsible for their actions, right? And I think Keynes would have agreed. But there are policies that the government can pursue to try and tone things down. But that makes Keynes very different from the sort of prevailing lefty philosophy at the time was Marxism. It was very popular. It wasn't like an out there thing. The way I think it still is in the United States. I think it's more I guess publicly accepted today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. But it was just very normal to be a Marxist at Cambridge University in 1930. It was very clear that the economy was collapsing, and here was a philosophy that said here's why it doesn't work. And most of these people were openly like revolutionary. They would say, the state will always answer to the capitalists. We have no choice but to overthrow them and to do a new kind of politics. And Keynes did not believe in that. He said we can use the state actually to help working people instead of having to overthrow things. So he's sort of a political moderate with a social agenda that is much more closely aligned.
That's seen as extreme in today's context. And I do want to ask you, because I think it's important for our listeners to understand it on just like a ground level. Why can't, or why, I want to ask you both things. Why can't or why don't, when the Fed comes out and says, we're going to guarantee, some financial instrument that's huge in the Wall Street market, we're backing that no matter what. So just so y'all know, you don't have to worry about, say, your bonds, that bond market. We're fucking backing that up no matter what. Go out and do all the other shit that you do, right? Just know that part of, your portfolio or whatever is taken care of by us. Why can't or won't the Fed or the government do that for Joe Sixpack?
Well, in a sense, it does, in that there is unemployment benefits exist, right? We already do this in a small. Right. We have programs like SNAP, like food stamps, so people can eat. The problem is that they're very, they're not particularly. I don't want to say generous because I don't think it's. I think people living in a democracy have a right to demand that the political system ensure that they live prosperous and healthy lives. I don't think it's an act of generosity to make sure that this happens. I think that's just what the government's job is. But they're insufficient programs. So in principle, the government does. It just doesn't do it very well. And one of the things that some of the more progressive members of Congress were calling for during the negotiations over how to respond to the coronavirus crash was a more robust set of what they called automatic stabilizers. So when the unemployment rate gets to a certain level, a certain amount of money starts going out the door to people, no matter what. You don't have to go back to Congress, every 3 months and say, okay, Republicans, what is it that we can get from you this month at this particular crisis point since the aid is running out? We've been governing by crisis since the Obama administration years. There's always some artificial deadline that Congress imposes on itself. Right. And then they get to the crisis and they're like, oh God, now we have to make a concession to people we don't want to make instead of just creating a policy that makes sense. And so that could be done, and it would cost trillions of dollars, and it would be fine. We do that with food benefits. We do that with benefits. It's the language around it is
crazy. Yeah. When the Republicans, or not even just Republicans, when politicians, because Democrats do it too, guys. When they call something entitlements, I don't even know, like it's got
like an icky sheen to it,
It's like a college kid driving a Beamer. You just like
exactly.
Entitlement basically makes it seem like some shit you don't deserve anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Right? It's like, what are you entitled to this? Like, I am, actually.
No, it's like, this is how old people pay for their medicine. It's not
right.
It's not kids driving sports cars. But like, the worry in the 1920s, when Keynes was doing most of his writing, was that the government would literally run out of money. Under the gold standard, every piece of paper, every dollar bill or mark or pound was tied to a specific weight of gold, and you could go to the central bank and say, I want to cash this in for gold at any time. And so what that meant was that if there was a run on your currency, if there was a lack of confidence, or if you just spent too much money, you would run out of gold, and then you wouldn't have any more money to spend. And then you would have a financial crisis. You would have a 2008 style event. And throughout the 20s and into the early 30s, you kept seeing these kind of 2008 style financial crises across Europe as investors would lose confidence in the ability of different countries to cash in their currencies for gold. And so they'd all dump it, and it would actually become a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy as everybody sold out. So there was this very different kind of economic problem tied to the currency, which I think policymakers, economists sort of just have never, they're starting to shake now, but have never quite shaken. If we overspend in the economy now, the thing that you worry about is that you actually just end up running the economy too hot. You have people who everybody is employed, everybody can afford things, right? And the prices of goods start going up because everybody's got the money to afford to buy them, so they sort of bid up the prices in this way. And a little bit of that, like you say, it's not that big a deal. The Fed is openly saying right now they want to have at least 2% inflation for the foreseeable future. They can't even get that trying to do it. So
it's at 1.2%. I think you said in your piece last week when the Dems swept Georgia.
Yeah. So I mean, and like 2% unemployment, 5%. I mean, sorry, inflation, 5%, 6 or 7% even is. I don't think we really want to have 7% unemployment, unemployment. We definitely don't want to have 7% unemployment, but 7% inflation just for the fun of it. But in terms of like the list of, if you gave me a list of potential problems, like I would take that over over millions of people being out of a job any day of the week. And the Fed has tools to fight inflation, right? The Fed can there are all sorts of things you can do to prevent inflation from going out of control. One of the things that economists did in the 60s and 70s, when you had this sort of turn towards neoliberalism and away from the sort of original thinking of its original sort of Keynesian thinking that was dominant in Europe and the United States for 1930 to like 1970, let's say. They would say, well, if you get a little bit of inflation, it automatically kind of quickly goes out of control because the prices get bid up to 4% and then to 7% and then to 10 and then to 50 and then to 1,000. And when you look at countries that have had hyperinflation crises, you do see these charts where things just really take off. All of a sudden, a mark goes from being worth like $5 to being worth like 2 cents to being worth like 1/trillionth of a cent. But most of those hyperinflation crises aren't a result of printing too much money. They are a result of complete collapse of faith in the political system. So in Weimar Germany, you have the French coming and occupying the Rhine, and people believe, okay, this government no longer exists. So this government's currency no longer exists, and we can't buy anything with it. So it's there's something going on with those hyperinflation moments that's different from what happens when, okay, we have 7 or 8% inflation.
And I want to talk to you about the deficit because I think that that is what made us want you on the show the most, because I told people last week, I was like, you can set your clock to Joe Biden's inauguration to when we're going to start hearing about deficit. We didn't hear deficit one fucking time throughout the Trump administration. Like, not one time did that word get uttered by McConnell. Fucking Ron Johnson takes out an op-ed, and I think Newsweek or USA Today, one of those shits, and he's talking about, well, the deficit's going to fucking kill you and our children and all of this shit. I want you to try to explain as best you can what deficit hawks the argument they're trying to make and why it's completely asinine and stupid. So
I think there's this sense with the deficit when this argument is made in good faith, which it often isn't. There's a sense that you're creating obligations for the future that the country will have to find a way to pay for, right? And it will pay for them in tax revenue. So somehow, if you're getting something today through borrowed money, then you're gonna have to tax people tomorrow to make good on it. And the more you borrow, the higher the interest rate, and the more pain you're causing in the future. And the simple basic problem with that, without even having to get into like deep Keynesian theory, is that the economy is not a static thing, right? And you have things that you have to do day to day to stay alive, to eat, that matter to you on those days that can't actually wait. If you wait too long and don't pay your rent, you're going to have a problem, right? A big problem. This is why people go to payday lenders, right? Like payday lenders are terrible and bad, but people recognize that getting kicked out of their house is bad. So they need to meet this obligation. The difference between going to a payday lender to get some money to pay your rent and the government borrowing money to help boost the economy is that the economy grows. When you go to a payday lender, you pay your bills. You do not get a raise from your job, right?
Right.
When the government borrows money and spends it, new economic activity is created. And so you have more stuff happening. And if you want to tax people from it, you can. But there is more wealth that is being created by that actual activity. The wealth that people exchange in society is represented by money, but it's not the piece of paper. Nobody thinks that there's $100 worth of cotton in a $100 bill. It's labor and risk and blood and sweat that is the actual value that is represented by this thing. And when you have more activity, you have a more prosperous society. So there's not this sort of fixed sum of money out there that we have to just sort of divide up over time. In fact, and this is where you get into the Keynesian stuff. I mean, one of the points that Keynes makes is that if you let uncertainty take over, if you have a crisis, it can feed on itself. And so it won't be that, eventually, he has that famous quote, in the long run, we're all dead.
Yeah.
We are all dead, but in the meantime, we have to live. And if you wait until things just work themselves out eventually, you could have had. I mean, he's particularly concerned about political upheaval. So he's saying, we could have a revolution or a fascist takeover, by the time the economy works itself out. And we don't really. That's not something we really want. But ultimately, you can have lower growth, and that's what you see in countries when they turn to austerity. They have lower growth, and they have a hard time paying back the loans that they received. I mean, throughout the 1990s, when we had all of these financial crises, and particularly in Asia, and the IMF would come in and say, "Here, we'll give you all this money, but only if you cut your budget deficit by a whole bunch." And they would do that, and then they wouldn't be able to pay back the loan because their economies had shrunk. And so they'd have to lay off all their teachers, and then they also still couldn't pay off the loans.
It got worse,
right? Because then their teachers couldn't. So you had this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction, and I mean we saw that again after 2008. And you look at what happened to Greece. It's I think the most glaring example of this austerity just not working, but also in the UK and really just about every country that Angela Merkel sort of beat over the head about with these austerity policies. They really struggled to make ends meet as a result of the austerity policies themselves. And sometimes in Europe it's a little trickier because the austerity policies are often demanded with a bit more, I think, sophistication than they are in the United States. Greece doesn't have a particularly good tax system. So rich people dodge taxes in Greece a lot. And so when Germany says, you need to raise taxes, I mean, they are largely talking about raising taxes on rich people. But nevertheless, the policies that were pursued between 2010 and 2015, I mean, were obviously catastrophic.
Right. Yeah, I think that, the politics of austerity and all this stuff, to the extent that it has any sort of popular understanding or purchase, it's just because you see numbers like the national debt and it's whatever the trillions, and it's scary to people. They're like, what? Are you what? Yeah. because they can equate it to their own lives. If they have that sense of debt, the anxiety would just be overwhelming. And to think that the whole country is doing that and has that, it makes you think oh my God, we can't do anything. That's crazy. But we're going to see that a lot. I think we're going to see that a lot in the coming months, especially as the Biden administration tries to do something to respond to the economic crash.
But deficits. This is a very common problem in. Sorry to interrupt. but
No.
not sorry enough not to interrupt. There's there's this problem where we people do sort of project their household onto the nation at large, but debt for a household is an obligation. For a country, it's a tool. It's a completely different thing. We're not talking about aggregating.
We should invent a new word.
Together. Yeah, we should.
It's like they're not. It's like they're really like just completely different things.
Right.
Yeah,
I think because what I think happens too, guys, is that people here, we borrowed money from China, and they think that China, like the money that we borrowed from China, is like the money they owe American Express, or the money they owe on their car note, or the money they owe on their mortgage. Right. Meaning, when or if they default, the bank, the repo man, whoever is coming to take that shit back. So essentially, when China or whoever decides to be the repo man for our country's debt, they're going to come and take this shit back somehow. That's what I think people envision when they think about our country's debt.
I think that's right, and I think you're right that people think that, and it's wrong. I mean, it's a different,
it's not
a different kind of thing.
It's wrong. It's wrong. You're wrong.
Yeah, it's like when people ask me about this stuff, like I'm not as well versed on economic policy as you are, Zach. But when people ask me this stuff, I always just gotta say, like, trust me, it's just not gonna. It's like not a problem. It's not gonna happen. Like, for me to try to explain to you why would take a long time, and it would be really boring, and I don't even have the best arguments for it, but it's just
but
it's
you know what's
wrong.
so crazy, Nando? I tell people, I'm like, you think basically $800 billion or $750 billion a year in military spending, and you think China could just come pick up their check when they want to?
Right, that's true. Like,
you
knock
really
on our
think
door
that?
and be like, "Yeah, give me the money back.
Give me my fucking money." Like, are you kidding me?
I mean, you guys are joking, but I mean, the dollar is a thing that exists as part of like international diplomacy. The thing that we call the economy, the stuff that we call economic policymaking, is domestic social management and international diplomacy. It's those two things. And the fact that it involves money, is that is the means through which this stuff is executed. But we're talking about diplomacy, and China doesn't want to make the United States default on its debt. That is a problem, not only for China, but for the whole world, because it creates massive instability, right? So there will always, we also just don't owe that much to China. I mean, we owe something like 8% of our debt is in foreign hands. So it's mostly money that we owe to Americans to the extent that we owe it to anybody.
Right?
But really,
Beautiful.
we owe it. I mean, we have this thing called the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve exists to manage the currency. It can buy as much U.S. government debt as it wants, and it often does.
And I think that you mentioned back in the days of the gold standard, there was this thing that like there was like physical gold that the government had, and that's like money. And now, but that's no longer the case. And we saw like with the CARES Act, which I know you've written a lot about, where the Federal Reserve just kind of like in 15 seconds, just like, oh, here's just make trillions of dollars just happen, and it's just like numbers on a computer going from one thing to another, and all of a sudden there's money. Like it really is kind of like, not to sound like it really is like a social construct, man, or something. It's
no, but it is, right? Yeah,
it is, right? And it's like, it's just a thing that it's really hard to understand on some level. Like, it's like our brains like don't work that way in a way to like understand that it is just something that can be created out of thin air, but then has this incredible power over literally everything. There are some rules by which it operates, and there are limits as to how much money you can actually invent and put out into the world. But there are also pretty clear signs that when you've got too much out there, that you see the economy overheating, you see inflation taking off, and we don't see anything close to that right now. And it's just important to remember that inflation is a policy choice. It's not this sort of brick wall disaster that you hit that thing, it's over. You can do different. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s,
Keynesian policymakers believed they had to sort of balance inflation and unemployment. They believed in this thing called the Phillips curve, which turned out to be not true, to be sort of fictional. But they believed there was, if you had more unemployment, you would have less inflation automatically. But if you had more inflation, you'd have less unemployment. So they tried to balance the two at a certain level. That ultimately was sort of chimerical. But at that time, they understood inflation as like, one of many problems that society could balance with others. And I think that basic thinking is important when you're looking at, it's been used since as a way of saying, oh, well, that's, it would be nice if we could afford nice things and people didn't have to live in poverty, but inflation. And I don't think that's I think even at places like the Fed, that thinking has faded quite a bit over the last few years since the crisis. There were people saying, if you believe this talk about debt and deficits leading to financial crises and hyperinflation, I mean, 2009 we should have seen it, right? We had this huge bank bailout.
Should have seen it.
And we had this huge fiscal relief package, and we didn't see anything close to inflation. Which is, if you go back and read the Wall Street Journal from 2009, 2010, there are all of these predictions from very important people, policymakers, economists saying, well, the price of grains went up by a half point. That's the canary in the coal mine. It's coming. Hyperinflation is right around the corner. By like 2013, they really stopped doing it. But all of those predictions turned out to be wrong. And I don't think those particular individuals have come forward and sort of offered an explanation.
Of course not.
But the overall worldview of the profession has shifted. Like, nobody writes essays every day saying, oh, those people were all wrong 10 years ago. But they do say, I believe we have more headroom for fiscal policy than we previously believed.
Right.
Like that.
And it strikes me as a funny kind of irony in a way, because that Obama was like this incredibly resplendent figure, transcendent figure in some way, inspiring figure. But because of this like insane idea that you're talking about, like his presidency probably will go down as like mostly in some ways like a failure. And now we have Joe Biden, who couldn't be a less inspiring figure. And, he couldn't be more opposite to Obama in every way as a figure. Like just no one is inspired by Joe Biden. He is just literally, but if just like as a matter of sheer dumb luck, like if this kind of dangerous idea, this obsession with inflation, if it's true that it really has kind of changed amongst elite policymakers, that the Biden presidency might turn out to be, a more successful one than an Obama, because if they do the kinds of economic relief that is necessary to address this crisis, Biden will be popular. Like it's just that's just how it works, and so it's just a funny kind of. It's just like a funny irony to me, right?
It's extraordinary, and I think I it's been a really bad like 10 years, so it's tough to muster too much optimism. But I do think I think what we've seen from the administration and also from the Senate on economic policy the last couple of weeks is promising. I mean, Chuck Schumer is saying they're going to do serious stuff on healthcare and climate change. I mean, we'll see what it is, but.
It's Chuck Schumer, so you can't never get too excited about anything.
No. But it's better than him saying we can't afford it, guys. We just can't afford it.
Okay, so that's what I want to get into, Zach. Before we get you out of here, I want to read you something that you wrote in that same piece about the Dems taking Georgia and what it means for them to control the House, the Senate, and the executive branch. And you said, where South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, Singapore, and other places swiftly implemented effective measures to avert both mass death and economic calamity, the United States has been an uncoordinated and morally callous disgrace. Bravo. Thank you. I love that you said that. But the reason why I bring that quote, Zach, is because I think me and Nando tend to have reputations with the people who fuck with this show and know us online and things like that for being flaming haired, lefty, crazy psychopaths who just want to kill centrists, which is mostly true. But can you please explain to people how they should feel about Democrats who might or would come out with tepid ideas or responses to the economic reality that faces. How should people feel about timid motherfucking Democrats? Please.
You know, it's funny because I really found myself, one of the reasons I wrote the book about Keynes is because I don't think I'm inherently still a super radical guy. I get where a lot of
you were in a punk rock band, dude.
Come to the dark side, Zach.
You're halfway there.
I mean, I'm a little curious, right? And I think Keynes was too. He saw the moral vision from people on the left and said, yeah, that's basically right. That's the world that we want to make happen. But he was very cautious about how to get there, and very frightened of social upheaval and of. He really believed that upheaval basically was an automatic win for the right. And I don't know if he was correct about that. I think he might have ultimately been overly cautious, but I get where he's coming from on that stuff. And I do think, there's a sense in which our problems are not just are not just baked into the structure of capitalism or colonialism or 1,000 years of human oppression. We could just choose a different way. We could just do things differently. We're not just totally condemned by structural forces beyond our control. And I think in this particular moment, there's an awful lot that you can do using the pandemic as a legitimate pretext for pretty expansive action. I mean, we saw what went wrong in this crisis. It wasn't just that people got sick and died. We don't have enough hospitals. We just don't. We need to build more hospitals, right? We clearly have a huge problem with the way global supply chains work. I mean, we had nurses treating people in in trash bags. I mean, that is a complete disgrace. And that's as a result of, an economy that's based entirely on offshoring, where you're just trying to squeeze every last dime you can from labor costs at every possible moment, and not worrying at all about how fragile your system is. There are big changes that need to be made to the country in order to actually address just the public health aspect of this moment. The economic side of all of this, with whether you do UBI and the like, obviously you can't let people just if you let working people default on all of their bills and get kicked out of their houses, then eventually, the rentiers are going to start feeling the pinch too. So you don't actually want to do that either, even if you're just looking out for the professional class in some way. So I just think Democrats have to recognize that they won't get a lot of bites at the apple on this one. Obama got one shot. Biden might get a couple. Because there are so many different crises happening at the moment that Republicans may be willing to play ball, and even if they aren't, you can do things through reconciliation. I mean, there's on fiscal policy especially. I mean, you can just get this stuff done with 51 votes. You don't even have to repeal the filibuster to do it. Although I do think filibuster is a barrier to progress in general. But they don't have to repeal the filibuster to get it. So this is an opportunity for Democrats to really make the world a better place for the people who they represent. And it will cost a lot of money, and it will be fine. The alternative is
Zach,
hundreds of thousands of people dying.
You are probably my single favorite guest who's ever come on this show. I know it's just you, Anna, and one other person. But listen, here's why. Because right now, and we see this happen all the time with stuff. And I know, Nando, you understand this too. There's some passion. There's some fire. You seen it. Remember when Kamala Harris fucking authored a bill that said $2,000 for each and every American under 75 G's? And then they got elected and she went fucking quiet about it, right? We see them do this shit all the time. So I just want the people who listen to the show to understand, when we come out and we talk shit about these centrist establishment Dems who might come out and say some dumb shit about a balanced budget or might utter the fucking the D word, the deficit word, and want to rip out our heads, Zach just beautifully, eloquently articulated why that's fucking bullshit. If you hear them say anything about, well, we have to be financially responsible and blah, 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 you know what's going on. It's not based on reality.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Zach, I really appreciate you coming on. Big fan of your work. I have to admit, I have not yet read your book, but it's next on my queue. I finished Reaganland, which took me forever because it was long as hell. But your book is next on my queue. The Price of Peace. It's a biography of John Maynard Keynes. It's been like, I can't stress enough. Just I can't remember a book about economics being this hot. Like it's like all year-end lists is very well reviewed. It's so
the guy's a fucking genius, Nando. What do you want?
There you go. So if you're listening to this show and you want to learn a thing or two about how a world can be, a different world can be constructed, a more humane world, a better world, check out The Price of Peace, the biography of John Maynard Keynes. Zach, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. All right, and guys, man, we'll see you guys next week. Make sure you're checking out every single other offering on the Bomb feed, whether that be Wednesday service, whether that be the OG show, whether that be Growing Up the Same. Make sure you're checking out All Things Count the Dings, man. Again, we want to thank our boy Zach Carter for coming on, Fernando Vila, for Rob Lopez on the ones and threes. We're out of here. Peace.
Love you.